Okay, after a long hiatus, we are back reading Marvin Minsky's The Society of Mind, and we're up to Chapter 6, Insight and Introspection. 6.1, Consciousness. In real life, you often have to deal with things you don't completely understand. You drive a car, not knowing how its engine works. You ride as passenger in someone else's car, not knowing how that driver works. Most strange of all, you drive your body and your mind, not knowing how your own self works. Isn't it amazing that we can think, not knowing what it means to think? Isn't it remarkable that we can get ideas, yet not explain what ideas are? In every normal person's mind, there seem to be some processes that we call consciousness. We usually regard them as enabling us to know what's happening inside our minds. But this reputation of self-awareness is not so well deserved because our conscious thoughts reveal to us so little of what gives rise to them. Consider how a driver guides the immense momentum of a motor car, not knowing how its engine works or how its steering wheel directs it to the left or right. Yet when one comes to think of it, we drive our bodies in much the same way. So far as conscious thought is concerned, you turn yourself to walk in a certain direction in much the way you steer a car. You are aware only of some general intention, and all the rest takes care of itself. To change your direction of motion is actually quite complicated. If you simply took a larger or smaller step on one side, the way you would turn a rowboat, you would fall toward the outside of the turn. Instead, you start to turn by making yourself fall toward the inside and then use centrifugal force to right yourself on the next step. This incredible process involves a huge society of muscles, bones, and joints, all controlled by hundreds of interacting programs that even specialists don't yet understand. Yet all you think is, turn that way, and your wish is automatically fulfilled. We give the name signals to acts whose consequences are not inherent in their own character, but have merely been assigned to them. When you accelerate your car by pressing on the gas pedal, this is not what does the work. It is merely a signal to make the engine push the car. Similarly, rotating the steering wheel is merely a signal that makes the steering mechanism turn the car. The car's designer could easily have assigned the pedal to steer the car or make the steering wheel control its speed. But practical designers try to exploit the use of signals that already have acquired some significance. Our conscious thoughts use signal signs to steer the engines in our minds, controlling the countless processes of which we're never much aware. Not understanding how it's done, we'd learn to gain our ends by sending signals to those great machines, much as the sorcerers of older times used rituals to cast their spells. 6.2. Signals and signs. How do you ever understand anything? Almost always, I think, by using one or another kind of analogy. That is, by representing each new thing as though it resembles something we already know. Whenever a new thing's internal workings are too strange or complicated to deal with directly, we represent whatever parts of it we can in terms of more familiar signs. This way, we make each novelty seem similar to some more ordinary thing. It really is a great discovery, the use of signals, symbols, words, and names. They let our minds transform the strange into the commonplace. Suppose an alien architect has invented a radically new way to go from one room to another. This invention serves the normal functions of a door, but it has a form and mechanism so far outside our experience that to see it, we would never recognize it as a door, nor guess how to use it. All its physical details are wrong. It is not what we normally expect a door to be, a hinged, swinging wooden slab set into a wall. No matter, just superimpose on its exterior some kind of decoration, symbol, icon, token, word, or sign that can remind us of its use. Clothe it in a rectangular shape or add to it a push plate lettered exit in red and white, and every visitor from the planet Earth will know, without a conscious thought, just what the pseudo-portal's purpose is, and use it as though it were a door. At first, it may seem mere trickery to assign the symbol for a door to an invention that is not really a door, but we're always in that same predicament. There are no doors inside our minds, only connections among our signs. To overstate the case a bit, what we call consciousness consists of little more than menu lists that flash from time to time on mental screen displays that other systems use. It is very much like the way the players of computer games use symbols to invoke the processes inside their complicated game machines without the slightest understanding of how they work. And when you come to think about it, it scarcely could be otherwise. Consider what would happen if we actually could confront the trillion-wire networks in our brains. Scientists have peered at tiny fragments of those structures for many years, yet failed to comprehend what they do. Fortunately, for the purposes of everyday life, it is enough for our words or signals to evoke some useful happenings within the mind. Who cares how they work, so long as they work? Consider how you can scarcely see a hammer except as something to hit with, or see a ball except as something to throw and catch. Why do we see things less as they are and more in view of how they can be used? It is because our minds did not evolve to serve as instruments for science or philosophy, but to solve practical problems of nutrition, defense, procreation, and the like. We tend to think of knowledge as good in itself, but knowledge is useful only when we can exploit it to help us reach our goals. 6.3 Thought Experiments. How do you discover things about the world? Just look and see. It seems simple, but it's not. Each casual glance employs a billion brain cells to represent the present scene and to summarize its differences from records of other experiences. Your agencies formulate little bits of theories about what happens in the world and then make you do small experiments to confirm or reformulate those conjectures. It only seems simple because you're unaware of what is happening. How do you discover things about your mind? You use a similar technique. You make up little bits of theories about how you think, then test them with tiny experiments. The trouble is that thought experiments don't often lead to the sorts of clear, crisp findings that scientists seek. Ask yourself, what happens when you try to imagine a round square, or when you try to be happy and sad at the same time? Why is it so hard to describe the results of such experiments or draw useful conclusions from them? It is because we get confused. Our thoughts about our mind experiments are mind experiments themselves, and therefore interfere with one another. Thinking affects our thoughts. People who program computers encounter similar problems when new programs malfunction because of unexpected interactions among their parts. To find out what's happening, programmers have developed special programs for debugging other programs. But just as in thought experiments, there is a danger that the program being watched might change the one that's watching it. To prevent this, all modern computers are equipped with special interruption machinery that detects any other program's attempt to alter a debugging program. When this happens, the culprit is frozen in its tracks so that the debugging program can examine it. To do this, the interruption machinery must be supplied with a private memory bank that can store enough information to make it possible later to restart the frozen program as though nothing had happened. Are brains equipped to do similar things? It was easy to build self-examination systems into computers that did only one thing at a time. But it would be much harder to do it in a system that, like the brain, engages many processes at once. The problem is that if you were to freeze only one process without stopping the others, it would change the situation you're trying to examine. However, if you were to stop all those processes all at once, you couldn't experiment on how they interact. Later, we'll see that consciousness is connected with our most immediate memories. This means that there are limits on what consciousness can tell us about itself. Because it can't do perfect self-experiments, That would require keeping perfect records of what happens inside one's memory machinery. But any such machinery must get confused by self-experiments that try to find out how it works, since such experiments must change the very records they are trying to inspect. We cannot handle interruptions perfectly. This doesn't mean that consciousness cannot be understood in principle. It only means that to study it, we'll have to use the less direct methods of science because we cannot simply look and see. 6.4. B brains. There is one way for a mind to watch itself and still keep track of what's happening. Divide the brain into two parts, A and B. Connect the A brain's inputs and outputs to the real world so it can sense what happens there, but don't connect the B brain to the outer world at all. Instead, connect it so that the A brain is the B brain's world. Now, A can see and act upon what happens in the outside world, while B can see and influence what happens inside A. What uses could there be for such a B? Here are some A activities that B might learn to recognize and influence. A seems disordered and confused. Inhibit that activity. A appears to be repeating itself. Make A stop. Do something else. A does something B considers good. Make A remember this. A is occupied with too much detail. Make A take a high-level view. A is not being specific enough. Focus A on lower-level details. This two-part arrangement could be a step toward having a more reflective mind society. The B brain could do experiments with the A brain, just as the A brain can experiment with the body or with the objects and people surrounding it. And just as A can attempt to predict and control what happens in the outer world, B can try to predict and control what A would do. For example, the B brain could supervise how the A brain learns, either by making changes to A directly or by influencing A's own learning process. Even though B may have no concept of what A's activities mean in relation to the outer world, it is still possible for B to be useful to A. This is because a B brain could learn to play a role somewhat like that of a counselor, psychologist, or management consultant who can assess a client's mental strategy without having to understand all the details of the client's profession. Without having any idea of what A's goals are, B might be able to learn to tell when A is not accomplishing them, but only going around in circles or wandering, confused because certain A agents are repeating the same things over and over again. Then B might try some simple remedies, like suppressing some of those A agents. To be sure, this could also result in B's activities becoming nuisances to A. For example, if A had the goal of adding up a long column of numbers, B might start to interfere with this because, from B's point of view, A appears to have become trapped in a repetitive loop. This could cause a person accustomed to more variety to find it difficult to concentrate on such a task and complain of being bored. To the extent that the B brain knows what is happening in A, the entire system could be considered to be partly self-aware. However, if we connect A and B to watch each other too closely, then anything could happen and the entire system might become unstable. In any case, there is no reason to stop with only two levels. We could connect a C brain to watch B brain and so on. 6.5. Frozen reflection. No supervisor can know everything that all its agents do. There's simply never time enough. Each bureaucrat sees but a fraction of what happens underneath its place in the pyramid of information flow. The best subordinates are those that work most quietly. Indeed, that's why we build administrative pyramids for jobs we don't know how to do or don't have time to do ourselves. It is why so many of our thoughts must hide beyond our consciousness. Good scientists never try to learn too much at once. Instead, they select particular aspects of a situation, observe carefully and make records. Experimental records are frozen phenomena. They let us take all the time we need to make our theories, but how could we do the same thing inside the mind? We'd need some kind of memory in which to keep such records safe. We'll see how this could work when we come to the chapters on memory. We'll conjecture that your brain contains a host of agents called K-lines, which you can use to make records of what some of your brain agents are doing at a certain moment. Later, when you activate the same K-lines, this restores those agents to their previous states. This makes you remember part of your previous mental state by making those parts of your mind do just what they did before. Then the other parts of your mind will react as though the same events were happening again. Of course, such memories will always be incomplete, since nothing could have capacity enough to record every detail of its own state. Otherwise, it would have to be larger than itself. Since we can't remember everything, each individual mind faces the same problem that scientists always face. They have no foolproof way to know before the fact what are the most important things to notice and record. Using the mind to examine itself is like science in another way. Just as physicists cannot see the atoms they talk about, psychologists can't watch the processes they try to examine. We only know such things through their effects. But the problem is worse where the mind is concerned, since scientists can read each other's notes, but different parts of the mind can't read each other's memories. We've now seen several reasons why we cannot simply watch our minds by sitting still and waiting till our vision clears. The only course left for us is to study the mind the way scientists do when something is too large or small to see, by building the theories based on evidence. Make a guess, test it with a shrewd experiment, collect one's thoughts and guess again. When introspection seems to work, it's not because we've found a magic way to see inside ourselves. Instead, it means that we've done some well-designed experiment. 6.6. Momentary mental time. What do you think you're thinking now? You might reply, why, just the thoughts I'm thinking now. And that makes sense in ordinary life, where now means at this moment in time, but the meaning of now is far less clear for an agent inside a society. It takes some time for changes in one part of a mind to affect the other parts. There's always some delay. For example, suppose you meet your friend Jack. Your agencies for voices and faces may recognize Jack's voice and face, and both send messages to an agency names which may recall Jack's name. But voices may also send a word message to Quotes, a language-based agency that has a way to remember phrases Jack has said before, while faces may also send a message to Places, an agency concerned with space, which might recall some earlier place in which Jack's face was seen. Now suppose we could ask both Places and Quotes which happened first, seeing Jack or hearing his voice. We'd get two different answers. Places will first detect the face, while Quotes will first detect the voice. The seeming order of events depends upon which message reached each agent first, so the seeming sequence of events differs from one agent to another. Each agent will react in its own, slightly different way because it has been affected by a slightly different causal history, which spreads like a wave into the past. It is simply impossible in general for any agent P to know for certain what another agent Q is doing at precisely the same time. The best that P can do is send a query straight to Q and hope that Q can get a truthful message back before other agents change Q's state, or change its message along the way. No portion of a mind can ever know everything that is happening at the same time in all other agencies. Because of this, each agency must have at least a slightly different sense both of what has happened in the past and of what is happening now. Each different agent of the mind lives in a slightly different world of time. 6.7. The causal now. Our everyday ideas about the progression of mental time are wrong. They leave no room for the fact that every agent has a different causal history. To be sure, those different pasts are intermixed over longer spans of time, and every agent is eventually influenced by what has happened in the common remote history of its society. But that's not what one means by now. The problem is with the connections between the moment-to-moment activities of largely separate agencies. When a pin drops, you might say, I just heard a pin drop, but no one says, I hear a pin dropping. Our speaking agencies know from experience that the physical episode of pin dropping will be over before you can even start to speak. But you would say, I am in love, rather than I was just in love, because your speaking agencies know that that the agencies involved with personal attachments work at a slower pace, with states that may persist for months or years. And in between, when someone asks, "What sorts of feelings have you now?" we often find our half-formed answers wrong before they can be expressed, as other feelings intervene. What seems only a moment to one agency may seem like an era to another. Our memories are only indirectly linked to physical time. We have no absolute sense of when a memorable event actually happened. At best, we can only know some temporal relations between it and certain other events. You might be able to recall that X and Y occurred on different days, but be unable to determine which of those days came earlier. And many memories seem not to be linked to intervals of time at all, like knowing that 4 comes after 3, or that I am myself. The slower an agency operates, that is, the longer the intervals between each change of state, the more its external signals can arrive inside those intervals. Does this mean that the outside world will appear to move faster to a slow agency than to a faster agency? Does life seem swift to tortoises, but tedious to hummingbirds? 6.8. Thinking without thinking. Just as we walk without thinking, we think without thinking. We don't know how our muscles make us walk, nor do we know much more about the agencies that do our mental work. When you have a hard problem to solve, you think about it for a time, then perhaps the answer seems to come all at once, and you say, "Aha, I've got it. I'll do such and such." But if someone were to ask you how you found the solution, you could rarely say more than things like the following: "I suddenly realized. I just got this idea. It occurred to me that." If we could really sense the workings of our minds, we wouldn't act so often in accord with motives we don't suspect. We wouldn't have such varied and conflicting theories for psychology. And when we're asked how people get their good ideas, we wouldn't be reduced to metaphors about ruminating and digesting, conceiving and giving birth to concepts, as though our thoughts were anywhere but in the head. If we could see inside our minds, we'd surely have more useful things to say. Many people seem absolutely certain that no computer will ever be sentient, conscious, self-willed, or in any other way aware of itself. But what makes everyone so sure that they themselves possess those admirable qualities? It's true that if we're sure of anything at all, it is that I'm aware, hence I'm aware. Yet, what do such convictions really mean? If self-awareness means to know what's happening inside one's mind, no realist could maintain for long that people have much insight, in the literal sense of seeing in. Indeed, the evidence that we are self-aware, that is, that we have any special aptitude for finding out what's happening inside our own selves, is very weak indeed. It is true that certain people have special excellence at assessing the attitudes and motivations of other persons, and more rarely of themselves. But this does not justify the belief that how we learn things about people, including ourselves, is fundamentally different from how we learn about other things. Most of the understandings we call insights are merely variants of our other ways to figure out what's happening. 6.9. Heads in the clouds. We'll take the view that nothing can have meaning by itself, but only in relation to whatever other meanings we already know. One might complain this has the quality of the old question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? If each thing one knows depends on other things one knows, isn't that like castles built on air? What keeps them from all falling down if none are tied to solid ground? Well, first, there's nothing basically wrong with the idea of a society in which each part lends meaning to the other parts. Some sets of thoughts are much like twisted ropes or woven cloths, in which each strand holds others both together and apart. Consider all the music tunes you know. Among them, you can surely find 2 tunes of which you like each one the more because of how it's similar to or different from the other one. Besides, no human mind remains entirely afloat. Later we'll see how our conceptions of space and time can be based entirely on networks of relationships, yet can still reflect the structure of reality. If every mind builds somewhat different things inside itself, how can any mind communicate with a different mind? In the end, surely communication is a matter of degree, but it is not always lamentable when different minds don't understand each other perfectly. For then, provided some communication remains, we can share the richness of each other's thoughts. What good would other people be if we were all identical? In any case, the situation is the same inside your mind, since even you yourself can never know precisely what you mean. How useless any thought would be if afterward your mind returned to the selfsame state. But that never happens, because every time we think about a certain thing, our thoughts go off in different ways. The secret of what anything means to us depends on how we've connected it to all the other things we know. That's why it's almost always wrong to seek the real meaning of anything. A thing with just one meaning has scarcely any meaning at all. An idea with a single sense can lead you along only one track. Then, if anything goes wrong, it just gets stuck. A thought that sits there in your mind with nowhere to go. That's why, when someone learns something by rote, that is, with no sensible connections, we say that they don't really understand. Rich meaning networks, however, give you many different ways to go. If you can't solve a problem one way, you can try another. True, too many indiscriminate connections will turn a mind to mush, but well-connected meaning structures let you turn your ideas around in your mind to consider alternatives and envision things that from many perspectives until you find one that works. And that's what we mean by thinking. 6.10. Worlds out of mind. There is no singularly real world of thought. Each mind evolves its own internal universe. The worlds of thought that we appear to like the best are those where goals and actions seem to mesh in regions large enough to spend our lives in, and thus become a Buddhist or Republican or poet or topologist. Some mental starting points grow into great coherent continents. In certain parts of mathematics, science, and philosophy, a relatively few but clear ideas may lead into an endless realm of complex yet consistent new structures. Yet even in mathematics, a handful of seemingly innocent rules can lead to complications far beyond our grasp. Thus, we feel we understand perfectly the rules of addition and multiplication, yet when we mix them together, we encounter problems about prime numbers that have remained unsolved for centuries. Minds also make up pleasant worlds of practical affairs, which work because we make them work, by putting things in order there. In the physical realm, we keep our bodies and clothes in self-made shelves and cabinets, thus building artificial boundaries to keep our things from interacting very much. Similarly, in mental realms, we make up countless artificial schemes to force things to seem orderly by specifying legal codes, grammar rules, and traffic laws. When growing up in such a world, it all seems right and natural, and only scholars and historians recall the mass of precedents and failed experiments it took to make it work so well. These natural worlds are actually more complex than the technical worlds of philosophy. They're far too vast to comprehend, except where we impose on them rules we make. There is also a different and more sinister way to make the world seem orderly, in which the mind has merely found a way to simplify itself. This is what we must suspect whenever some idea seems to explain too much. Perhaps no problem was actually solved at all. Instead, the mind has merely found some secondary pathway in the brain through which one can mechanically dislodge each doubt and difference from its rightful place. This may be what happens in some of these experiences that leave a person with a sense of revelation, in a state in which no doubts remain, or with a vision of astounding clarity, yet unable to recount any details. Some accident of mental stress has temporarily suppressed the capacity to question, doubt, or probe. One remembers that no questions went unanswered, but forgets that none were asked. One can acquire certainty only by amputating inquiry. When victims of these incidents become compelled to recapture them, their lives and personalities are sometimes permanently changed. Then others, seeing the radiance in their eyes and hearing of the glory to be found, are drawn to follow them, but to offer hospitality to paradox is like leaning toward a precipice. You can find out what it is like by falling in, but you may not be able to fall out again. Once contradiction finds a home, few minds can spurn the sense-destroying force of slogans such as "all is one." 6.11. Insight. Suppose that while you walked and talked, you could watch the signals that traverse your brain. Would they make any sense to you? Many people have done experiments to make such signals audible and visible by using biofeedback devices. This often helps a person to learn to control various muscles and glands that are not usually under conscious control, but it never leads to comprehending how their hidden circuits work. Scientists encounter similar problems when they use electronic instruments to tap into brain signals. This has led to a good deal of knowledge about how nervous systems work, but those insights and understandings never come from observation by itself. One cannot use data without having at least the beginnings of some theory or hypothesis. Even if we could directly see all the interior details of mental life, it wouldn't tell us how to understand them. It might even make that enterprise more difficult. By overwhelming our capacity to interpret what we see, the causes and functions of what we observe are not themselves things we can observe. Where do we get the ideas we need? Most of our concepts come from the communities in which we're raised. Even the ideas we get for ourselves come from communities, this time the ones inside our heads. Brains don't manufacture thoughts in the direct ways that muscles exert forces or ovaries make estrogens. Instead, to get a good idea, one must engage huge organizations of submachines that do a vast variety of jobs. Each human cranium contains hundreds of kinds of computers developed over hundreds of millions of years of evolution, each with a somewhat different architecture. Each specialized agency must learn to call on other specialists that can serve its purposes. Certain sections of the brain distinguish the sounds of voice from other sorts of sounds. Other specialized agencies distinguish the sights of faces from other types of objects. No one knows how many different such organs lie in our brain, but it is almost certain that they all employ somewhat different types of programming and forms of representation. They share no common language code. If a mind whose parts use different languages and modes of thought attempted to look inside itself, few of those agencies would be able to comprehend one another. It is hard enough for people who speak different human languages to communicate, and the signals used by different portions of the mind are surely even less similar. If Agent P asked any questions of an unrelated Agent Q, how could Q sense what was asked or P understand its reply? Most pairs of agents can't communicate at all. 6.12. Internal communication. If agents can't communicate, how is it that people can, in spite of having such different backgrounds, thoughts, and purposes? The answer is that we overestimate how much we actually communicate. Instead, despite those seemingly important differences, much of what we do is based on common knowledge and experience. So even though we can scarcely speak at all about what happens in our lower level mental processes, we can exploit their common heritage. Although we can't express what we mean, we can often cite various examples to indicate how to connect structures we're sure must already exist inside the listener's mind. In short, we can often indicate which sorts of thoughts to think, even though we can't express how they operate. The words and symbols we use to summarize our higher level goals and plans are not the same as the signals used to control lower level ones. So when our higher level agencies attempt to probe into the fine details of the lowest level submachine that they exploit, they cannot understand what's happening. This must be why our language agencies cannot express such things as how we balance on our bicycles, distinguish pictures from real things, or fetch our facts from memory. We find it particularly hard to use our language skills to talk about the parts of the mind that learn such skills as balancing, seeing, and remembering before we started to learn to speak. Meaning itself is relative to size and scale. It makes sense to talk about a meaning only in a system large enough to have many meanings. For smaller systems, that concept seems vacant and superfluous. For example, builders' agents require no sense of meaning to do their work. Add merely has to turn on get and put. Then get and put do not need any subtle sense of what those turn-on signals mean, because they're wired up to do only what they're wired up to do. In general, the smaller an agency is, the harder it will be for other agencies to comprehend its tiny language. The smaller two agencies are, the harder it will be to translate between them. This is not because there are too many meanings, but because there are too few. The fewer things an agent does, the less likely that what another agent does will correspond to any of those things. And if two agents have nothing in common, no translation is conceivable. In the more familiar difficulty of translating between human languages, each word has many meanings, and the main problem is to narrow them down to something they share. But in the case of communication between unrelated agents, narrowing down cannot help if the agents have nothing in common from the start. 6.13. Self-knowledge is dangerous. To know oneself more perfectly might seem to promise something powerful and good, but there are fallacies concealed behind that happy thought. No doubt, a mind that wants to change itself could benefit from knowing how it works, but such knowledge might as easily encourage us to wreck ourselves if we had ways to poke our clumsy mental fingers into the tricky circuits of the mind's machinery. Could this be why our brains force us to play those games of mental hide and seek? Just see how prone we are to risk experiments that change ourselves, how fatally we're drawn to drugs, to meditation, music, even conversation, all powerful addictions that can change our very personalities. Just see how everyone is entranced by any promise to transgress the bounds of normal pleasure and reward. In ordinary life, our pleasure systems help us learn and therefore to behave ourselves by forcing checks and balances on us. Why, for example, do we become bored when doing the same thing over and over, even if that activity was pleasant at first? This appears to be one property of our pleasure systems. Without enough variety, they tend to satiate. Every learning machine must have some such protective scheme, since otherwise it could get trapped into endlessly repeating the same activity. We are fortunate to be equipped with mechanisms that keep us from wasting too much time, and it is fortunate too that we find it hard to suppress such mechanisms. If we could deliberately seize control of our pleasure systems, we could reproduce the pleasure of success without the need for any actual accomplishment, and that would be the end of everything. What prevents such meddling? Our minds are bound by many self-constraints. For example, we find it hard to determine what's happening inside the mind. Later, when we talk about infant development, we'll see that even if our inner eyes could see what's there, we'd find it singularly hard to change the agents we might want most to change, the ones that, in our infancy, helped shape our longest-lasting self-ideals. These agents are hard to change because of their special evolutionary origin. The long-term stability of many other mental agencies depends on how slowly we change our image of what we ought to be like. Few of us would survive if left to random chance. Our most adventurous impulses could tamper freely with the basis of our personalities. Why would that be such a bad thing to do? Because an ordinary change of mind can be reversed if it leads to a bad result. But when you change your self-ideals, nothing is left to turn you back. Sigmund Freud theorized that each person's growth is governed by unconscious needs to please, placate, oppose, or terminate our images of parental authority. If we recognize the influence of those old images, however, we might consider them too infantile or too unworthy to tolerate and seek to replace them with something better. But then what would we substitute them for them? Once we divested ourselves of all those ties to instinct and society, we'd each end up as instruments of even more capricious sorts of self-invented goals. It's mainly when our systems fail that consciousness becomes engaged. For example, we walk and talk without much sense of how we actually do those things. But a person with an injured leg may, for the first time, begin to formulate theories about how walking works. To turn to the left, I'll have to push myself that way. And then, perhaps consider which muscles might accomplish that goal. When we recognize that we're confused, we begin to reflect on how our minds solve problems and engage the little we know about our strategies of thought. Then we find ourselves saying things like this: "Now I must get organized. Why can't I concentrate on the important questions and not get distracted by those other non-essential details?" Paradoxically, it is smart to realize that one is confused, as opposed to being confused without knowing it. For that stimulates us to apply our intellect to altering or repairing the defective process. Yet we dislike and disparage the sense of confusion, not appreciating the quality of this recognition. However, once your bee-brains make you start to ask yourself, what was I really attempting to do? You can exploit that as an opportunity to change your goals or change how you describe your situation. That way you can escape the distress of feeling trapped because there seem to be no adequate alternatives. The conscious experience of confusion can resemble pain. Perhaps this is because of how they both impel us to discover ways to escape from a predicament. The difference is that confusion is directed against a person's own failing state of mind, whereas pain reflects exterior disturbances. In either case, internal processes must be demolished and rebuilt. Both confusion and pain have injurious effects when they lead us to abandon goals on larger scales than appropriate. The entire subject makes me feel ill. Perhaps I should abandon the whole project, occupation, or relationship. But even such dispiriting thoughts can serve as probes for finding other agencies that might be engaged for help. 6.14. Confusion. It is mainly when our other systems start to fail that we engage the special agencies involved with what we call consciousness. Accordingly, we're more aware of simple processes that don't work well than of complex ones that work flawlessly. This means that we cannot trust our offhand judgments about which of the things we do are simple and which require complicated machinery. Most times, each portion of the mind can only sense how quietly the other portions do their jobs.